Hey everybody. As promised, I will have this up by Friday, so hopefully you're watching it on Friday. Um, but we are going to cover chapter 12 online. And chapter 12 continues our conversation around institutional corrections, and we're going to look specifically at what life is like in prison. There's a whole body of research around prison subcultures and how people survive in prison, and some fascinating dynamics around the different sexes in prison, how um, men's life is in prison versus how women's life is in prison and things like that. So we're going to go over all of that. And then we're going to turn our focus to reentry and kind of talk about how do prisoners reintegrate into communities and what is successful reentry look like. So as always, even though this is an online lecture that you can watch at your convenience, please make sure you're taking notes. Not everything that not everything on the slides will be covered, as far as I will add material to this that will not be on the slide. So please make sure that you are listening and taking notes so that you can capture all the material. All right, without further ado, let's look at prison life. So there are more than 1.5 million Americans that are currently incarcerated in state and federal prisons. And prison life isn't cheap. It costs on average about $35,000 annually to maintain prisoners in prison, and that's for each prisoner. So $35,000 per prisoner annually is the cost of institutional corrections. Many correctional institutions have common missions or what their purposes are. And there are four major themes through that institutions have as their missions. So, one is they ensure that they're protecting the public, they're ensuring the safety of the personnel that work inside the prison, they're providing care and supervision of inmates. And finally, there's some sort of mention or some sort of value of re-entry or reintegration of the prisoners as a priority back into their communities. So the state is responsible for the safety and well-being of those it incarcerates and the public, which you can see based off of those common themes throughout institutional corrections mission. So I'm going to repeat those themes one more time. So all the missions typically have something about protecting the public, protecting the safety of the officers and personnel that work inside the prison, providing care and supervision of inmates, and reentry is commonly in there. So, offenders entering prison must change their behaviors, attitudes, and language in order to conform to prison and the unofficial convict rules and regulations. So, we have um, a social contract that kind of dictates how we live our lives outside of institutional corrections. We've all agreed on the norms and the values and things like that. Well, prisons also have a social contract. It's typically known as the convict code or convict rules, but they are unspecified rules that prisoners live by on a daily basis in order to make sure that their stay in prison is as comfortable as possible. The process of learning these codes, or what we call socialization process um, in prison, is known as prisonization. Prisonization allows the inmates to learn um, how to behave in prison. And the degree of adherence to prison culture may vary during incarceration, but it tends to be lowest in the first 6 months and the last 6 months of incarceration. So, in essence, when someone enters prison, they're learning how to act, how to carry themselves, who to associate with, who not to associate with. Um, all of those socialization processes are new, and it takes about 6 months to acclimate, that research has shown us. So, within the first 6 months, most prisoners aren't adhering to that inmate code of conduct or prison culture. They're learning how to. And then the last 6 months of their incarceration, they typically try to break apart from that prisonization um, to learn kind of how to act back in the real world. All right, so we said that prisonization is the socialization process of people learning how to adapt and survive in prison. Well, academics have come up with empirical evidence to kind of show how prisoners go about in the prisonization process. And kind of it helps us understand how inmate behavior works. And so the first of these models is known as the deprivation model. And in essence, deprivation model says that inmates are deprived of five basic essential things known as pains of imprisonment. So they have to adapt to being deprived of their liberty, of their freedom of movement. They have to be acclimated to being deprived of getting goods and services, of intimate sexual relationships, of having their own autonomy, or freedom to just do what they want. And they have to learn to be deprived of their security. Because while we say that we can keep them safe and the purpose of prisons partially is safety, no one can guarantee prisoner safety. And so part of the prisonization process is learning how to act and how to survive with all the deprivation going on. And those specific five primary pains that I talked about, liberty, sexual relationships, goods and services, autonomy, and security, are known as the pains of imprisonment under the deprivation model. So, under this model, we recognize that inmates often feel helpless and they feel like they're outcast. They don't know where to fit in yet because they're still learning the socialization process. So that's one of the models that we look at when we look at trying to help describe inmate behavior and this prisonization process. Another model that we look at um, is known as the importation model. And the importation model means that experiences and socialization from the outside world are brought in with the prisoner and contribute to their behavior. So, all the values and morals that you are taught and that you live by on a daily basis, your lenses that you look through um, when solving problems, all comes in with you. And all of that adds up to control your behavior in prison and how you socialize in the prisonization process. The importation model was kind of heralded by a man named John Irwin and Donald Cressy. And the importation model is really a key model in what is known as convict criminology. And convict criminology is the study of crime and correctional systems that really kind of challenge the status quo. So, convict criminology is really studying um, crime and the system through the convict's eyes. And so, through this process, we've learned that the behavior that a person brings with them, whether it be their beliefs, their morals, their viewpoints, their experiences, none of that can be negated in explaining their behavior in prison. In fact, the importation model says that is why convicts act the way they do, is because of all of the experiences from the outside that they bring in. Now, as with most criminology, um, we have a third model known as the situational model. And the situational model essentially emphasizes place, time, and person to understand the behavior. So it takes the best of deprivation and importation and marries them together. And it basically says how an individual interacts and behaves in prison is based on the situation. It's based on the place, the time, and the individual person. The situational model recognizes that inmates import their viewpoints and their beliefs, but also recognizes that they're learning how to still be deprived of these liberties that they are accustomed to having, or these pains of imprisonment. And it's a new situation that they haven't been put into a lot of times. So the situational model says, based on their outside influences, their beliefs, all of that, when that meets the current level of pains of imprisonment, that's going to dictate how they act in the situation. All right, so let's turn our attention to um, specifically female subculture in prison. So, females experience prison differently than males. And that's a controversial statement to say. However, I want you to sit back and look at the research that your book describes. So, we know that the majority of females are there for drug or property offenses. We know that the majority of females that are incarcerated have substance use issues. Um, Scholarly research has shown us that it could be from previous traumas that they're masking with substance use or whatever, but we know that substance abuse is prevalent in the in female subculture, female inmate subculture. Um, we know that um, the women that are in prison typically have been primary caregivers for at least one, but mostly two children. So by being incarcerated, their familial norm has been broken. And research with comparing and contrasting male and female inmate experiences has shown that females tend to create what is known as the pseudo family relationship culture. And the pseudo family relationship culture really kind of is what you think it is. It's relationship structures built in female prisons that replicate family relationships left behind when incarcerated. So there's a tendency or a stereotype of neediness, passiveness, and domestication um, in the female subculture that continues in their incarcerated settings. Um, Contemporary research shows men and women experience many of the same forms of the pains of incarceration. However, women may experience these pains in a harsher way. So remember, one of the pains of imprisonment was the deprivation of your liberty and your autonomy. Well, if you're taking away a mother from her family, she's going to experience those pains of imprisonment much harsher than the male counterpart. So females typically create this family dynamic, and we see a rise of homosexual relationships in the female subculture to kind of fill the void for what is missing. They there is higher level, or I should say there are higher levels of emotional distress, mental illness, and engaging in self-harm in the female subculture, counter to their male counterparts. Just because of the lack of, um, well, lack is not a good word, because of their experiences, um, the way they experience the pains of imprisonment is harsher. So it's harsher on their mental health. So we've talked a little bit about empirical modeling of how we study inmate behavior. So you have the three models around prisonization, the prisonization process, the deprivation model, the importation model, and the situational model. We've looked at kind of some special topics of female, um, subculture. So now let's kind of turn and look at some of the other dynamics in correctional settings. So we covered this in our lecture, but I wanted to re-highlight it. There is an entire classification system of that prisons employ to ensure that people are placed appropriately within the system. So remember, we talked about diagnostic prisons, where a prisoner will initially go for a short time and be observed by professionals to kind of make sure that they are in the right custody level. Um, Diagnostic prisons help us choose the correct population and security level, um, to to better ensure safety. So once you go through that classification system is no joke, guys. It depends on, there's several different factors. So custody level ranges from community, minimum, medium, and maximum, and it depends on an inmate's escape risk, disruptiveness, or proneness to assaulting others, so their violent tendencies. Um, but the goal of the correctional system is to provide the least restrictive possible environment that still protects the prison and the public. So you want to try to get them in the least restrictive environment that's the best for their safety and the safety of the public. And classification, um, systems help us do that. Now, we also talked about solitary confinement in class, and I'm not going to go over solitary confinement again, but we know that solitary confinement is overused. We know that solitary confinement, can be used for punishment or protection, um, but we also know that it's borderline torture. And so we talked about the UN's stance on solitary confinement in class. Um, but you're going to want to know some of the arguments against and for solitary confinement. So, um, some of the arguments against solitary confinement, uh, is the expense that it is. So, solitary confinement costs $78,000 per day. Per day. And it exacerbates mental illness. In fact, the American Psychological Association notes that segregation longer than 3 or 4 weeks seriously harms prisoners, um, and affects their mental health. So we had that conversation around solitary confinement. Now let's take a look at prison violence. When we talk about prisons, I imagine that you have seen a lot of what pop culture kind of imagines prison life being, and that is extremely violent, extremely segregated, um, tumultuous landscapes, things like that. And they're not far wrong. Um, there's a hint of truth in those myths, and we're going to kind of look at those. So, violence takes many forms in prison. It can be physical, it can be sexual. There are three main types of violence, however, that we know happens and that scholars look into on a normal basis. You have inmate on inmate, so prisoner on prisoner violence. You have inmate on guard, so prisoner on personnel. And then you have guard on inmate violence. So research is typically done within those three main areas of prison violence. And we know that violence can occur for any number of reasons. So, inmate on inmate violence can occur due to gang activity, perceived injustice, um, extortion, or just acting out. Inmate on guard can happen for the exact same reasons: gang violence, extortion, um, perceived injustice. We see a lot of perception issues with inmate on guard. With guard on inmate, it's very interesting because guard on inmate typically happens in to instill fear or superiority. And there's a whole body of research that I had my graduate professor was an expert in around inmate on or guard on inmate misconduct. And it's fascinating just the way that we pick guards, and there are certain personality characteristics of guards that play a factor into role superiority and kind of having to maintain that control, instantly turning to violent means to control instead of other nonviolent means. Be remiss if we did not talk about prison gangs. Prison, when people think of prison, they typically think of gangs and gang activity happening in prison. So prison gangs really originated in the 1950s, and gangs pose an incredible security risk to the facility, to staff, to other inmates in prison because they can bring on warranted or unwarranted violence at any moment. And so prison officials try to keep a hold on gang activity. There are special officers that are um, prioritized with um, getting intel on gangs and kind of weeding out gang leaders and gang activities. But when we look at the history of prison gangs, we see that the majority of prison gangs were formed to ensure protection. So, part of the prisonization process that new inmates come into is, remember, um, they're lacking security, so they may need to find means to make sure that they are secure and safe, and they may turn to gangs in prison to do that. We know that gangs in prisons are typically drawn down racial lines. So you have like the Aryan Brotherhood, who are white supremacists, typically follow a Nazi ideology. Um, they were first formed in San Quentin in 1967. Then you have the Mexican Mafia, which is one of the most active gangs in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And it was formed in California in the 1950s. And so there are many other not as popular gangs as like the pop culture, but pretty much everyone has heard of the Aryan Brotherhood or the Mexican Mafia. And really, these gangs provide a blanket sense of protection to its members. However, violence can permeate outside of the prison walls and into the prison walls by these gangs. There are gang leaders who can lead whatever activities happen outside of the prison walls from their cell. And so prison gangs and gang membership permeates most institutional correction conversations because uh, you you can't understand prison subculture without understanding why gangs exist. Now, when we talked about the types of violence, I highlighted sexual violence and physical violence. The exact amount of sexual violence that occurs is difficult to determine due to um, the inmate code of silence, due to inmate code of conduct, due to prison officials suppressing that information. All of this kind of plays a role into how we understand sexual violence in prisons. So in 2003, there was a federal law that was signed into law. It was known as the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA. And the purpose of PREA is to provide safeguards and address issues of sexual violence. PREA allows and mandates that prisons keep better records and statistics around prison rape and sexual violence. However, many rapes still go unreported, and wardens tend to suppress and think that rape is rare. Um, PREA is still in existence today, and in the correctional facility, PREA is really your safeguard for any sexual type violence. So, PREA opens up federal funding to have programming around sexual violence. Um, it mandates that prisons have some type of reporting system in place when inmates or guards see inappropriate sexual relationships, things like that. So PREA really kind of revolutionized corrections and institutional corrections around sexual violence. In 1994, there was a landmark case that was decided, Farmer v. Brennan. And in essence, Farmer v. Brennan um, said that it was a violation of the Eighth Amendment to not protect inmates from sexual violence. And so Farmer v. Brennan really kind of led the way on sexual violence reform. And Farmer v. Brennan really kind of helped usher in this PREA movement. But uh, methods for combating sexual violence in prison include like that classification system that we talked about. There are specific areas on the classification system where we take into consideration previous victimization, sexual victimization, or previous sexual perpetration. We also identify vulnerable inmates and try to control and restrict all relationships, even if they're consensual. Screening for high risk factors may also kind of help lower the number of incidents. So you screen for like age, physical size, disability, sexual orientation is also a screening tool that we utilize to kind of help ensure that sexual violence doesn't happen or that person doesn't become victimized while they're serving their time. So, Farmer v. Brennan was not the first kind of inmate rights issue that had been taken up by the Supreme Court, but we didn't really see court intervention in prison processes until the 1960s. And really, then in the 1960s, you started looking at different challenges around the treatment of inmates, the conditions that they were living in, and then kind of their due process rights for like administrative hearings. So in 1974, there was a case known as Wolf v. McDonald. And basically, in this case, an inmate was charged with an offense in prison, like a violation of the rules, not a new legal charge, but like a violation of prison rules. And so that inmate did not get a full hearing, did not get notified of what they were alleged to have been charged with, and all of that. So they sued and said that they were treated unfairly because they did not have full due process rights and due process protections. The Supreme Court in Wolf v. McDonald um, basically said that prisoners are not entitled to due process right protections during disciplinary hearings. However, they do have some rights that they have to um, make sure that that the prison doesn't violate. So, under Wolf v. McDonald, prisoners need to be given written notice of charges during disciplinary hearings. They need to be provided with written statements of evidence against them and must be able to call witnesses and present evidence. So, Wolf v. McDonald dealt specifically with disciplinary hearings inside prison. And the court said those disciplinary hearings are not really legal hearings. So while you have due process rights under the Fifth and Sixth Amendment and legal proceedings, you're not entitled to all of those rights in an administrative disciplinary hearing. However, you do have some rights. You need to know what you're being charged with. You have a right to have that given to you in writing. You have a right to have whatever evidence they say they have against you presented to you in writing as well. And you have a right to defend yourself in those administrative hearings, disciplinary hearings. And so you have a right to call witnesses on your behalf in those hearings. While they're not fully legal hearings, they're quasi legal hearings in the way that they're set up. So you do have some rights. You just don't have all of the rights entitled to you under the Fifth and Sixth Amendment. There was a case before Wolf that was known as Cooper v. Pate, and it was done in 1964. And Cooper v. Pate essentially allowed inmates to bring lawsuits against federal prisons to the Supreme Court under the Civil Rights Act of 1871. So Cooper v. Pate, 1964, set the groundwork for Wolf v. McDonald to even be heard because before Cooper, prisoners could not bring these um, violations or so called alleged violations to the court to be heard. And the final case I kind of want you to know about is Sandin v. Connor. And Sandin v. Connor basically um, increased standards under which inmates could present witnesses, and it granted the right to freedom of speech and religion. So Sandin v. Connor essentially granted the right of freedom of speech and religion to prisoners in jail, in prisons. So we see kind of an evolution of prisoners gaining some rights while they're incarcerated, and some of the protections that free men get are also afforded to prisoners via Wolf, via Sandin, via Cooper. All right, so let's turn our attention to reentry. Now, remember going back earlier in our lecture, we talked about how one of the primary goals of prisons is reentry, and helping inmates reintegrate into their communities as lawful citizens. This is accomplished through a process known as parole, and parole is essentially a conditional release from prison. So its counterpart is probation. And we've talked about probation, where people don't, they get sentenced to community probation in lieu of going to prison. Well, people coming out of prison back into the community that still have time left on their original sentences come back to the community under parole. Um, Federal parole has been abolished. If you are in a federal institution and have been convicted of a federal crime, you do not have the option of federal parole. So most of our parole discussion is really targeted towards states and state inmates. Um, and so every state has what's known as a parole board. And these are individuals that are normally appointed by the governor, and their sole purpose is to meet with inmates and hear the inmates' uh, appeals to be released from prison on conditional releases. Now, many prisons offer reentry programming that inmates can take while they're being incarcerated. So, reentry programming can be anything from GED programs, skill building programs, carpentry programs, technical type programs, all the way up to college. Inmates can get college degrees while they're incarcerated. Reentry programs can also take the form of different types of treatment. So, like, they can do substance abuse treatment and graduate from 12 steps, or they can have significant gains being made to treat their mental health. These type of reentry programs help bolster the argument of the inmate to be released on parole. If they've taken advantage of these programming functions while they've been incarcerated, they have gained new skills that will help them be successful on release. And so the parole board has a tough job. They weigh the pros and cons, always adhering to the notion of public safety, but ultimately make the determination of whether inmates can be released on parole. The Bureau of Justice Statistics notes that approximately 596,000, a little over 596,000 inmates are released on parole annually. And so you see that parole is pretty utilized. And if you think back to the beginning of class when we had the Department of Community Supervision come in, they supervise both probationers and parolees. So they are both probation officers and parole officers. In Georgia, they used to be separate, and they used to be two separate departments. So there was a Department of Corrections that did um, probation, and then there used to be a Department of Corrections and Parole that just did parole. They combined those two departments really in 2014, I want to say. And so those officers deal with both populations and supervising both populations. Successful reentry has some key requirements, and you will need to make sure that you kind of understand what makes reentry successful. Well, it requires job training, some type of employment skills, because when the inmate gets out, they're going to have to get a job to support themselves. So it requires some type of job training, employment counseling, and employment counseling is different than job training because employment counseling is how do you go and get a job? How do you find jobs? How do you interview for jobs? What do you do when you actually get a job? You show up on time. How do I get up on time? It kind of helps the inmates know how to be successful in the workforce. And then there's something called placement programming. So when someone gets out of prison, they are typically carry the scarlet letter of being a prisoner. And so most of them have been convicted of felonies. And so most applications on job applications, on housing applications, on all of those type of applications, they have to list that they are convicted felons, which automatically disqualifies them from a lot. And so there's a need to have specialized housing placement programming in place to help inmates secure a place to live. After all, if we give them the skills to get a job, but then dump them on the side of the road, um, how are they going to maintain that job if they don't have a place to live? And so, successful reentry programs really kind of focus on job skills, employment counseling, and placement programming in teaching inmates how to find, how to locate, and maintain housing and employment. And since 2005, we have seen that recidivism rates for parolees have declined. Now, when we talked about community corrections, we talked about the overall recidivism rate is higher for incarcerated individuals and lower for community corrections, showing that community corrections probably is a better choice in rehabilitating offenders. Why? Because it leaves them in their environment and teaches them the skills to be successful in their current environment. Well, successful reentry programs teaches inmates how to be successful in the environment that they're going to. And so that has helped decrease recidivism rates. There are a couple of other factors that are really important for successful reentry. One of those is having some tie to the community in form of relationships. So many ex-convicts have few friends or family members they can rely upon uh, when they get released. However, those that typically are successful are ones who do have friends or family that will help them maintain in the community. In fact, marriage and consistent relationships are a leading factor in helping uh, parolees be successful. A majority of uh, former prisoners depend on family for housing after release, and spouses or children are more likely to recognize deviant behavior and call it out. So they kind of keep their loved one in check from ever going back to their criminal behavior. Other crucial factors for success, financial support, encouragement, all of that kind of leads to a inmate being successful upon their release. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about is kind of the special population of sex offenders. Now, we know that we have extreme get tough legislation at every level when it comes to sex offenders. So we know that we have created additional hurdles for sex offenders when they re-enter the population from prison. So a lot of them have to register. Most of them have restrictions around where they can and can't live. Um, Most of them have restrictions around where they can and can't work. If they can't be live within so many feet of a schoolyard, they can't work in an arcade. Or if they can't be around children, they can't be around like places that children would frequent. Um, a lot of them have consistent GPS tracking, um, and have bans from like the internet. Um, I don't know, I actually just got an email from my old neighborhood that two sex offenders moved into like a 50-mile radius. So there are certain watchdog agencies that once an offender is released will then kind of publicize where that offender is. So that offender never really gets a fresh start after they've served their time because of the heinousness of their crime. Now, I want you to think, what if you were 18 years old and a senior in high school, and you had a relationship with a 14-year-old that was in high school? That relationship was found out, and you were charged with statutory rape and sentenced and convicted as a sex offender. You do your time in prison and you come out. You are not what is considered predatory. There's a major, major difference between an offender who is a predator, who actively seeks um, children to abuse, and someone who was in the situation that I just gave you, who committed stat rape, but has to wear the mark of the sex offender label. That label kills their entire life, um, just due to the hurdles that we've put in. And so reentry is very, very hard for sex offenders. And most of the sex offenders that reenter have successfully completed their prison terms or have been paroled because they are non-violent offenders. So the question comes, should we treat them like they're predators? And has this fear mongering and the consequences of fear mongering really kind of set this population up for failure? Now, hear me when I say predatory sex offenders deserve the hurdles. They are probably not going to get out of prison on parole. It is your low level offenders that get out on parole that kind of, the way that we treat them is counterproductive to the reentry philosophy, and setting them up for success upon their reentry. So that's just something I want you to think about. But this population, you do have to realize, has extreme hurdles that they have to overcome to even integrate back into society. And they are never truly integrated because they're always going to wear the scarlet letter. All right. So that concludes our lecture and chapter 12. I hope you all have a great break. And the next time we meet, we will spend some time talking about the juvenile justice system. So if you need anything, feel free to reach out.